Now moving on to Canadian news.
Yes.
What is the latest news with regard to all these senators who are being investigated by various committees for wrongdoings?
Well, what we found out today, and this is in the House of Commons question period today, is that the government has now acknowledged that the RCMP is investigating. The NDP was asking that the RCMP investigate this scandal where we have unelected, unaccountable senators under investigation now who were trying to tell Canadians that they were able to investigate themselves. And we have pushed to have the RCMP involved. They are now involved, and they're looking at the expense accounts of Senators Duffy and Wallen, Mac Harb, the Liberal senator, and others, and saying, show us the evidence so that there can be, a clear and clean investigation done. And so the RCMP is involved. But what we now see is that we have our Prime Minister who's refusing to be accountable to Parliament. He's in Peru and today in Colombia, as a matter of fact. And he only answered 2 questions yesterday to the media on this issue. And we're wanting the Prime Minister to come back to Canada and actually be accountable on this fiasco. And to remind your listeners and your viewers, this is about senators like Senator Duffy, Senator Wallen, Senator Brazeau, who are all Conservative senators who now quit and were pushed out of the Conservative caucus, and Senator Mac Harb, who's a Liberal, who, and people will find this unacceptable, as we do, that they were saying that they were not living in Ottawa when in fact they were. I know, I live in Ottawa and I see them all the time. And they were charging for their housing expenses outside of Ottawa where they weren't living. I mean, some of these people had cottages that they would go to in the summer. And yet they were charging for their housing allowance here in Ottawa. So that's what that's how they broke the rules, and that's what the issue is about. But on top of it, we had, of course, the Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister writing a check to Senator Duffy to the amount of $90,000 to pay for his illegal claim of housing expenses. And where it's at now is, well, who directed Mr. Wright? Did the Prime Minister know about this? And if he didn't know about the $90,000, did he know that Mr. Wright, as the Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, was actually going to be engaged with trying to fix the problem, as they say? We're also looking at the fact that there was 2 reports on this misspending of the and over accounting for their housing expenses by these senators. There was 2 reports, and one of the reports, particularly one for Mr. Duffy, was changed. And the report by the auditors, they initially wanted to look at all of his receipts, and lo and behold, before they could get the full report from Mr. Duffy, he had repaid $90,000, which was the amount that he had taken from taxpayers. And we wanted to know who told him he should pay that, who was involved in that cover-up. And we still haven't gotten answers. So we'll be looking tomorrow to ask more questions, but we'll be also looking for the Prime Minister to come back and actually answer to Canadians as to, how this could happen, why he hasn't really addressed it. He said he was sorry, sort of, yesterday in Peru, but he hasn't said that to Canadians here in Canada. The other day when he had his press conference, or he allowed the media to be at this caucus meeting, he gave a speech but wouldn't answer questions. And I give you that example versus President Obama, who had controversy around their Internal Revenue Agency there, implicated in a bit of a scandal around disclosure of certain information. President Obama spent as much time as was necessary answering questions from the media. He dealt with it by firing the head of the IRS. and has an investigation as to what happened. Here, we have a Prime Minister who basically talks about how great and accountable they are, that there's really nothing else they can do since Nigel Wright has resigned, and that's it. So we need to have more disclosure from the Prime Minister. We need him to be back here in Canada answering questions to media, to parliamentarians, and to Canadians as to what happened here. Finally, we believe as the NDP that it's time we looked at whether the Senate should exist. We think it's time for the Senate to go. It's an institution that is unelected, it's unaccountable, and right now it's under investigation by the police and others. And the only people who go to the Senate are those who are appointed by the Prime Minister of the day. So we have former, fundraisers, as they call bagmen for the Liberals and for the Conservatives, and we don't see the purpose of the Senate anymore. And now they've shown how dysfunctional they are, because instead of having an outside audit that was uninterrupted, that was going to be independent, they were actually investigating themselves, and that just shows you how out of touch they are. And the NDP has called for a long time, frankly, that it's time for the Senate to go. It's time for the people to tell the Senate thank you, but this institution's time has come and gone, and to roll up the red carpet and say goodbye to the Senate and save taxpayers a lot of money, and also bring a lot more accountability to our parliamentary democracy.
So do you think the Prime Minister will be putting a lot of pressure once he returns back to Canada on this issue?
I think what you're going to see is a Prime Minister who will continue to be defensive on it. I think he's going to try and put up this shield saying, I've done everything I can, that there will be investigations from the RCMP and the Ethics Commissioner, and that will be it. And I should mention to you that there are investigations from the Ethics Commissioner from the House of Commons, as well as the Senate is doing their own investigation, which I find, it's not credible, but the RCMP investigations will be interesting. But the Prime Minister, I think you'll find, is going to be isolated on this because he didn't respond in a proper way to begin with. And I think he's going to probably find it very difficult to just say, well, I've done enough. And I think what you're going to find is that he's going to have to take further action, either by allowing a wider investigation to happen, which is what we're calling on Prime Minister to do, or he's going to have to fire more people, because depending on what happens with the Ethics Commissioner's findings, which we hopefully will see by next week, I think the wish of the Conservatives at this point is to rag the puck, as we say, to delay things so that they can make people forget over time, and that by the time we recess for the summer, that they will be able to just say they've done enough and stonewall and hope that people will forget over the summer. I don't think that's going to be the case. This is too big. This has gone right into the Prime Minister's office. When you have RCMP investigations and you have the Chief of Staff paying off a senator, this is too big for Canadians to forget, and certainly for the official opposition, for the NDP. We believe it's too important for our democracy to just say, well, you've had your Chief of Staff go and the senators involved are gone, and that's sufficient. We think we need to see more independence in the investigation. And I think the Prime Minister is going to find it very hard to say no to that. But I think for the short run, he'll probably try and hide behind the fact that Mr. Wright has resigned, and that he will say that's enough. And we certainly don't agree.
Okay. How much responsibility does the Prime Minister's office have with respect to some of these senators, particularly Mike Duffy?
This is a very important question you ask, because most people will say, well, the Senate is a separate institution, and, the Prime Minister is not responsible for the activities of these senators. And I remind people that, one, the Prime Minister appoints these senators. So the first thing is that they're members of his caucus. Every Wednesday, they meet, the senators and the MPs for both the Conservative and Liberal parties, because they have senators in their caucus. And they look at the strategies, they share information. And in the case of Mike Duffy, it's really important because, of course, Mr. Duffy was being used by the Prime Minister to carry the Conservative Party message and to raise money for the Conservative Party. The Prime Minister just recently said he thought Mr. Duffy was a good man. He was showing leadership when he responded to the scandal in the way he had by paying back his housing allowance. So this goes right to the Prime Minister. His fingerprints are all over this in terms of Mr. Duffy, and that's why it's so scandalous. It's not just any particular senator. During the 2011 election, the NDP had complained about the fact that Mr. Duffy was in places like Toronto, raising money on behalf of the Conservative Party, traveled there on taxpayers' expense, and we didn't believe that was right. We now find out that not only had Mr. Duffy claimed expenses for going to Toronto and for other election activities to raise money for the Conservative Party, but he was also claiming those expenses from the Conservative Party and from the Senate, which is from taxpayers. And this was on the request of Mr. Harper and his team. In other words, this was the most important senator for the Conservatives, Mr. Duffy was, because he was raising money, he was traveling, he was campaigning, and he was doing it at the behest of the Prime Minister directly.
Okay. I know how you mentioned how you got the NDP would like to see some changes with the process of Senate appointments.
Yeah.
What does NDP stand on this, and how would your party like to see this reformed?
Well, we've had a long-standing policy on this, and it is very simple. Abolish the Senate. Get rid of it. Your listeners and viewers should know, provinces used to have senates as well. So we'd have a legislative assembly for the elected officials, and there was always an appointed Senate. They got rid of theirs decades ago. And we believe that at this point in time, in 2013, an institution that was actually created before we had electricity should probably say, thank you, and it's time you go. Just so listeners and viewers know, we have a very strong provincial system now, which we didn't have at Confederation. And when Confederation was being negotiated, the Senate was there to represent the regions. We now have provinces that do that. Provinces are very capable of representing regions, as are, frankly, MPs coming from regions. The Senate has outlived its purpose. We believe it's important that we go to Canadians and ask them what they think, and to put it to Canadians, via referendum, and ask them whether they want to keep the Senate or not. We think it's a very important question for them that, there's no way that the Conservatives can be trusted to be independent on this question. They've tried to come up with ways to elect senators. It will never work, simply because you cannot have senators have the same power as members of Parliament, because there's fewer of them. But further to that, it adds extra politicians that, frankly, we don't need. We need to have better working committees. We need to have elections that are run fairly so that they're going to express the will of the people. But to have appointed people in a Senate in 2013, we think is wrong, and we think it's time that the Senate be abolished. In the interim period, because you can't do it overnight, we think a couple of things should happen. One is that senators shouldn't be involved in fundraising for Liberals or Conservatives, that senators shouldn't be campaigning, out there for Conservative or Liberal parties, that they should remain very quiet when it comes to partisan politics, and until such time as the Senate has been abolished, they should not be involved in the day-to-day operations of both the Conservative and Liberal parties, because they do not represent electors. They have not been elected. They don't have a legitimate. They don't have a legitimate power from the people, and for that reason, we think they should, until such time as the Senate has been entirely abolished or entirely reformed in some way that people have not been able to come up with yet, they should not be involved, be it the Liberal or Conservative parties, in their day-to-day operation.
Okay. So just one small question is, so how effective do you think the federal government is if we abolish the Senates?
I think it can be very effective and more effective. I'll give you an example. Jack Layton was able to get a bill passed to deal with climate change, and this was a very straightforward bill, and it went through the House of Commons before the 2011 election. It was back in 2008, and he was able to get a bill that would have had the federal government deal with climate change in a serious way. That bill went to the Senate, and the Senate killed the bill. And that showed how irresponsible the Senate is, and frankly, the Conservatives were, because it was Stephen Harper who basically said kill the bill because he didn't like it. So what we would see is that when we pass legislation that goes to the House of Commons and it becomes law, it wouldn't be, there would be no barriers to that. And that's important. What I can also say is that there would be an opportunity here to look at democratic reform. As many of your listeners will know, we have a system that is first past the post, that is, simply put, is we elect members of parliament to form governments, but we have challenges with that because, you can win a majority government with 39% of the vote, as the Conservatives did last election, with only just over, whatever it was, 60% of people voting. And this shows that it's not a genuine majority. So if we were to abolish the Senate, there's also other measures that could be put in place to make sure that we strengthen the accountability in our parliament. So make sure committees of parliament are more independent. Right now, they basically do the work of the PMO. Well, we could change the way committees work to make them more independent, as we see in the United States or we see in the United Kingdom. So, one aspect of this is to bring democracy to our parliamentary system by abolishing the Senate, but also at the same time strengthen the independence of committees to make sure that we're not going to just be satisfied with getting rid of the Senate, but also strengthen the opportunities for Canadians to have real opposition and oversight of the government of the day. But I think it would be as I said before, something that is due, the abolition of the Senate, something that would actually help with our system of government, and that we could also look at other measures to strengthen accountability and strengthen our democratic institution of Parliament, and that's something that would be, I think, welcomed by most Canadians.
Paul Dewar, once again, thank you for taking time and speaking to us today on Sri Lankan issues as well as Canadian political news.
And thank you so much for such well-informed questions and for your time, and it's really nice to meet you over the phone.
Thank you. I look forward to meeting you in person next time you're in Toronto.
It sounds good. I get there often.
Okay. I appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you, sir, and I hope you have a nice day.
You too. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.